How I discovered my siblings were poisoning my father to speed up their inheritance. I found the antifreeze bottle hidden behind the cleaning supplies under my father's kitchen sink when I was looking for drain cleaner. The bottle was 3/4 empty and had a sticky residue around the cap that didn't match the dust covering everything else in that cabinet. My father lived alone in the house where we grew up, a craftsman bungalow in Portland that he'd maintained obsessively for 40 years. He never kept automotive supplies under the kitchen sink. I pulled the bottle out and set it on the counter, staring at the bright green liquid while my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. My father had been sick for 6 months with symptoms the doctors couldn't explain. Kidney failure, they said, unexplained neurological issues. He was 72 and declining rapidly. My older brother Nathan and younger sister Veronica had been his primary caregivers since the symptoms started, visiting daily to help with meals and medications while I lived 3 hours away in Seattle, working 80-hour weeks at an architecture firm. I came down every other weekend when I could get away, but Nathan and Veronica handled everything else. They'd been so devoted, so attentive. I stood there holding that antifreeze bottle and felt my entire understanding of reality tilt sideways. My father was sleeping in his recliner when I walked back into the living room. He looked 20 years older than he had at Christmas, his skin gray and papery, his hands shaking even in sleep. The hospice nurse had been there that morning and told me he probably had weeks left, maybe a month. His organs were shutting down and nobody could explain why. I'd driven down from Seattle on a Friday afternoon because Nathan called saying I should come soon if I wanted to say goodbye. I sat on the couch across from my father and pulled out my phone to search what antifreeze poisoning looked like. The symptoms list made my hands go numb. Kidney failure, neurological damage, confusion, nausea, weakness. Every symptom my father had been experiencing since March. Ethylene glycol poisoning, the articles said, was often used in murders because it was sweet-tasting and could be mixed into drinks without detection. It caused the exact kind of organ failure my father was dying from. I took photos of the antifreeze bottle from every angle, then put it back exactly where I'd found it under the sink. My father stirred in his chair and opened his eyes, looking at me with confusion before recognition slowly returned. "When did you get here?" His voice was weak and slurred, another symptom the neurologist couldn't explain. I told him I'd arrived an hour ago, and he nodded like he was trying to track time but couldn't quite manage it. He asked if Nathan had been by today, and I said I didn't think so. He seemed worried about that, saying Nathan usually came every morning to help him with breakfast and medications. I asked what medications he was taking, and he gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. I found 7 prescription bottles on the counter, all filled within the past 3 months. Kidney support supplements, anti-nausea medication, pain management, nothing that should be causing his decline. I took photos of every label and sent them to myself. When I came back to the living room, my father had fallen asleep again. I sat there, watching him breathe, and tried to convince myself I was wrong about what I'd found. Maybe there was a rational explanation for antifreeze under the kitchen sink. Maybe he'd bought it months ago for his car and forgotten about it. Maybe I was jumping to horrible conclusions because I'd been working too hard and wasn't thinking clearly. But the bottle had been hidden behind other items, and the sticky residue suggested recent use. I called my wife Amanda from the driveway, standing next to my car where my father couldn't hear me through the windows. I explained what I'd found, and she went quiet for a long time before asking if I was absolutely sure about what I was suggesting. I said I wasn't sure about anything except that my father was dying from unexplained kidney failure, and there was an opened bottle of antifreeze hidden in his kitchen cabinet. She asked if I'd confronted Nathan or Veronica, and I said not yet, that I needed to think through what to do next. She told me to call the police immediately, but I couldn't bring myself to do it without more evidence. If I was wrong, I'd destroy what was left of our family over a misunderstanding. If I was right, I needed to be absolutely certain before making accusations that would send my siblings to prison. Amanda made me promise not to eat or drink anything in that house, and to get my father to a hospital as soon as possible. I agreed and hung up, then sat in my car trying to figure out my next move. Nathan's truck pulled into the driveway 20 minutes later. I watched him get out, carrying a grocery bag, and head toward the front door with his key already in his hand. Nathan looked surprised to see me when he walked inside and found me sitting on the couch. He was 3 years older than me, 46 to my 43, and had always been the responsible one who stayed local while I pursued my career in Seattle. He worked as a contractor and had flexible hours that let him check on our father daily. He set the grocery bag on the kitchen counter and started unpacking items while asking how long I'd been there. I said about 2 hours and he nodded, saying he'd brought Dad's favorite soup from the deli down the street. He pulled out a container and started heating it on the stove, moving around the kitchen with comfortable familiarity. I asked how often he'd been coming by, and he said every morning and most evenings, sometimes more if Dad called needing help. He said Veronica usually came by around lunch to make sure Dad ate something and took his medications. They'd been coordinating Dad's care between them for 6 months, while the doctors ran test after test without finding answers. Nathan brought the soup over to Dad's chair and woke him gently, helping him sit up enough to eat. I watched Nathan spoon-feed our father with patience and care that made my suspicions feel monstrous. Veronica arrived 30 minutes later while Nathan was washing the soup bowl in the kitchen sink. She was 40 years old and worked remotely as a graphic designer, which gave her flexibility to help with Dad's care. She hugged me and said she was glad I'd made it down, that she knew work had been crazy, but Dad would be happy to have me here. She pulled a pill organizer from her purse and started sorting medications while Nathan dried dishes. I watched them move around each other with practiced coordination, discussing Dad's symptoms and medications and upcoming doctor appointments. They'd created an entire caregiving routine without me, and I'd been grateful for it because it meant I could focus on my career without worrying about Dad's daily needs. Now I sat there wondering if everything I'd witnessed over the past 6 months had been an elaborate performance. Veronica asked if I wanted to stay for dinner, and Nathan offered to order pizza. The normalcy of the conversation made me feel insane, but I agreed because I needed to watch them more carefully and figure out what was actually happening. I stayed at Dad's house that night, telling Nathan and Veronica I wanted to be there in case he needed anything. They both seemed pleased I was finally taking a more active role in his care. After they left, I searched the entire house for more evidence. I found nothing else suspicious in the kitchen, but Dad's home office had files spread across the desk that I'd never seen before. Estate planning documents. The will had been updated 4 months ago, in May, around the same time Dad's symptoms got significantly worse. I photographed every page. The estate was worth approximately $3 million between the house, retirement accounts, and investment portfolios. Everything was split 3 ways between Nathan, Veronica, and me. Equal shares. But there were also documents showing Nathan had been made power of attorney and healthcare proxy in March, right when Dad's illness started. I sat at that desk until midnight reading through financial records and trying to understand the timeline. Dad's illness began in March. Nathan got power of attorney that same month. The will was updated in May. Now it was September, and Dad was dying of kidney failure that nobody could explain. I called a toxicology lab in Portland the next morning and explained that I suspected poisoning. The woman on the phone asked if this was a criminal matter, and I said I wasn't sure yet, that I needed testing done privately before involving authorities. She said they could test for common poisons, including ethylene glycol, but I'd need to bring in samples. I asked what kind of samples, and she listed blood, urine, hair, or any food or drink the person might have consumed. I told her I'd call back. Then I called my father's primary care physician and asked to speak with Dr. Reese directly. His receptionist put me through after I explained it was urgent regarding my father's declining condition. Dr. Reese sounded tired when he picked up, like he'd been through this conversation too many times. I asked if anyone had tested my father for poisoning, and he went quiet. Then he said they'd run standard toxicology panels months ago when the symptoms first appeared, and everything came back normal. I asked specifically about ethylene glycol, and he said that required a specialized test they didn't typically run unless there was specific reason to suspect it. He asked why I was asking, and I told him I'd found antifreeze in my father's house, and his symptoms matched poisoning. Dr. Reese said he could order the specialized test immediately if I brought my father in that afternoon. I agreed and hung up, then woke my father from his morning nap to tell him we needed to go to the doctor. He was confused about why, saying he'd just seen the hospice nurse yesterday, but I helped him get dressed and into my car anyway. He fell asleep during the 20-minute drive to the medical center. Dr. Reese met us in the exam room and drew blood while explaining to my father that they wanted to run one more test to rule out some possibilities. My father was too weak to ask many questions. The test would take 48 hours to process. Dr. Reese pulled me aside in the hallway and said if the test came back positive for ethylene glycol, he'd be legally required to report it to authorities as suspected poisoning. I told him I understood. He said ethylene glycol poisoning was highly treatable if caught in time, but my father's kidney damage was already severe. We might be too late to reverse the harm, but we could potentially stop further deterioration. I thanked him and took my father home. Nathan called while I was helping Dad back into his recliner. He asked where we'd been because he'd stopped by that morning and nobody was home. I said I'd taken Dad to see Dr. Reese for a follow-up, and Nathan's tone shifted to something defensive. He said he usually handled all of Dad's medical appointments, and I should have told him we were going. I said it was a last-minute thing, and Nathan asked what the doctor said. I told him they were running more tests, and Nathan wanted to know what kind of tests. I kept my voice neutral and said just some additional blood work to rule things out. Nathan said he'd come by later that evening to check on Dad and bring dinner. I said that wasn't necessary, that I had everything covered for the weekend. There was a long pause before Nathan said he'd come by anyway because he wanted to make sure Dad was okay. I told him we'd see him then and hung up. My father had fallen asleep again in his chair, his breathing shallow and labored. I sat across from him and tried to imagine my older brother slowly poisoning him over 6 months while pretending to be a devoted caregiver. I searched Nathan's truck that afternoon while my father slept. I'd seen him leave his keys on the kitchen counter when he visited yesterday. The truck was parked in Dad's driveway, and I used the spare key to unlock it, knowing I was potentially tampering with evidence but unable to stop myself. I found nothing suspicious in the cab or under the seats. The truck bed was filled with construction equipment and tools. Then I opened the center console and found a small notebook with dates and amounts written in Nathan's handwriting. The entries went back 6 months, starting in March. Small notations like 5 ml morning and 10 ml evening with check marks next to them. The most recent entry was from 3 days ago. I photographed every page of that notebook, my hands shaking so badly I had to brace my arms against the truck to keep the images from blurring. This was documentation of dosing. Nathan had been keeping records of how much poison he was giving our father and when. I put the notebook back exactly where I'd found it and locked the truck, then went inside and vomited in the bathroom. Veronica arrived that evening before Nathan, carrying a casserole dish covered in foil. She said she'd made Dad's favorite chicken and rice and wanted to make sure he ate properly. I watched her plate the food in the kitchen and asked if she'd been bringing meals regularly. She said a few times a week that she liked to cook, and Dad wasn't eating well on his own. She brought the plate to Dad and helped him eat while making cheerful conversation about her work and asking about his day. My father smiled at her with genuine affection and managed a few bites before saying he wasn't hungry. Veronica didn't push him, just covered the plate and said she'd leave it in the fridge for later. I asked if I could try some and she looked pleased, serving me a portion while saying she hoped I liked it. I moved the food around my plate but didn't eat any of it, claiming I'd had a late lunch and wasn't very hungry. Veronica's expression shifted slightly, something disappointed crossing her face before she smiled again and said there would be plenty for later. Nathan arrived 30 minutes after that with Chinese takeout he said was from Dad's favorite restaurant. The 3 of us sat in Dad's living room that evening while he slept in his chair, and I observed my siblings with new awareness. They were so normal, so concerned, asking me questions about my drive from Seattle and my work and Amanda and our plans for the weekend. Nathan mentioned that Dad probably didn't have much time left, and we should start thinking about funeral arrangements. Veronica teared up and said she couldn't believe we were losing him so young, that 72 wasn't old anymore, and he should have had another decade, at least. They talked about their memories of growing up in this house, the way Dad had taught Nathan carpentry in the garage and helped Veronica with her art projects in the dining room. They painted a picture of devoted children honoring their father's memory while sitting 15 feet from him as he slowly died from poison they'd been feeding him for 6 months. I excused myself and went to the bathroom where I called Amanda and told her about the notebook. She said I needed to call the police immediately, that I had enough evidence now to justify an investigation. I said I was waiting for the toxicology results to be absolutely certain. She told me I was putting myself at risk by staying in that house, but I couldn't leave my father alone with them. Nathan left around 9 o'clock after helping Dad to bed. Veronica stayed longer, insisting on cleaning the kitchen and organizing Dad's medications for the next day. I watched her sort pills into the weekly organizer, handling each prescription bottle with practiced efficiency. She asked if I was planning to stay through the weekend, and I said probably through Monday, since I'd already told work I needed family time. She seemed pleased by that answer and said it was good for Dad to have all his children around him during this difficult period. After she left, I went through every medication bottle she'd touched and photographed the labels again, then locked them in my car trunk. I replaced them with identical bottles I bought from a 24-hour pharmacy, filling them with vitamins that looked similar to the original pills. If Nathan or Veronica had been tampering with medications in addition to the antifreeze, I'd just eliminated that vector. I spent that night sleeping on Dad's couch, waking up every hour to check that he was still breathing in the next room. Dr. Reese called Monday afternoon with results that confirmed ethylene glycol in my father's blood at levels indicating chronic poisoning over an extended period. He said he was legally required to report this to the police and adult protective services, and that my father needed to be hospitalized immediately for treatment. I agreed and told him I was bringing Dad in within the hour. Then I called the Portland Police Department and asked to speak with someone in the detective division. I was transferred to Detective Olivia Cross, who listened to my entire story without interrupting. When I finished, she said she needed me to bring all the evidence to the station immediately, including the antifreeze bottle and photographs of the notebook. She said officers would meet me at the hospital to ensure my father's safety and begin building a criminal case. I packed my father's overnight bag while he dozed in his chair, too weak to ask many questions about why we were going to the hospital again. I told him the doctors wanted to try a new treatment that might help him feel better. He just nodded and let me help him to the car. The hospital admitted my father directly to the intensive care unit where they started aggressive treatment for ethylene glycol poisoning. Dr. Reese explained that the standard treatment was fomepizole, an antidote that prevented further kidney damage, but my father's kidneys were already severely compromised. He'd need dialysis and possibly a kidney transplant if he survived the initial treatment. The poison had been accumulating in his system for months, and the damage was extensive. I sat with my father while nurses ran IV lines and connected monitors, watching his confusion as he tried to understand why he was suddenly in intensive care. Detective Cross arrived 2 hours later with a uniformed officer and asked if she could speak with me privately. We went to a small consultation room down the hall, and I gave her everything I'd collected over the past 3 days. The antifreeze bottle, the photographs of the notebook from Nathan's truck, the timeline of Dad's illness correlating with Nathan gaining power of attorney, the estate documents showing the $3 million inheritance. Detective Cross reviewed everything methodically, taking notes and asking specific questions about my siblings' access to my father and their caregiving routine. She asked if I had any proof that Nathan or Veronica had actually administered the poison, and I admitted I didn't have direct evidence, just circumstantial facts that painted a damning picture. She said the notebook was strong evidence of intent, especially combined with the antifreeze bottle and the timing of the power of attorney. She'd be requesting warrants to search both Nathan's and Veronica's homes, and she wanted to interview them separately before they had time to coordinate stories. She asked if I thought both siblings were involved or if one might have been acting alone. I told her about watching Veronica sort medications in Dad's kitchen and Nathan's defensive reaction when I took Dad to the doctor without telling him. She said poisoning cases often involved multiple family members working together, especially when significant money was at stake. The estate was worth $3 million split 3 ways, which meant each sibling stood to inherit $1 million once Dad died. Nathan called my cell phone while I was still talking with Detective Cross. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message on speaker so the detective could hear. Nathan's voice sounded agitated, asking where Dad was because he'd stopped by the house and nobody was there. He said he'd been trying to reach me all afternoon and was worried something had happened. The message ended with him saying he was heading to the hospital to check if Dad had been admitted. Detective Cross said we needed to intercept him before he reached my father's room. She called hospital security and requested they prevent anyone except immediate family approved by me from accessing the ICU floor. Then she positioned herself near the elevator, Banks, and told me to act natural when Nathan arrived. I went back to my father's room and sat beside his bed, watching monitors track his vital signs while IV medication dripped into his arm. A nurse came in every 15 minutes to check his status. My father drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally asking where he was and why he felt so tired. Nathan found me 30 minutes later, pushing past the nurse's station with his face flushed and angry. He demanded to know why Dad was in the ICU and why I hadn't called him immediately. I stood up and told him the doctors had admitted Dad for treatment of his kidney failure. Nathan moved toward Dad's bed, and I stepped between them, saying the doctors wanted to limit visitors while they stabilized his condition. Nathan's expression shifted to something I'd never seen before, a cold calculation behind his eyes. He asked what treatment they were using, and I said they were trying a new medication protocol. He wanted to know specifics, and I told him I didn't understand all the medical details. Nathan pulled out his phone and said he was calling Dr. Reese directly because, as Dad's healthcare proxy, he had the right to make decisions about treatment. I told him to go ahead and make the call. He stepped into the hallway, and I watched through the window as he spoke intensely into his phone for several minutes. When he came back, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. They tested him for poison. Nathan's voice was flat, stating a fact rather than asking a question. I confirmed that they had, and the results came back positive for ethylene glycol. Nathan stared at me for a long moment and then said someone must have made a mistake, that Dad wouldn't have ingested antifreeze accidentally. I agreed it wasn't an accident, and Nathan's expression hardened. He asked what I was implying, and I said I wasn't implying anything, just stating facts. Dad had been poisoned over an extended period. Someone with regular access to his food and drinks had been adding antifreeze systematically for months. Nathan said that was insane, that I was making horrible accusations based on nothing. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photo of the notebook from his truck. His face went white, and he took a step back toward the door. Detective Cross chose that moment to enter the room with her badge displayed. She introduced herself and asked Nathan if he'd be willing to answer some questions about his father's care. Nathan refused to speak without an attorney present. Detective Cross said that was his right, but she was executing a search warrant for his home and vehicle, and he'd need to come to the station for formal questioning. She read him his Miranda rights, while I stood there watching my older brother's face cycle through denial, anger, and fear. He looked at me once with an expression of pure betrayal before allowing the uniformed officer to escort him out. Detective Cross asked if Veronica had visited yet, and I said not since yesterday evening. She said officers were already at Veronica's apartment with a search warrant, and she'd be brought in for questioning within the hour. I asked if I should call her and give her a chance to turn herself in voluntarily. Detective Cross said absolutely not, that I shouldn't have any contact with either sibling until the investigation was complete. She left 2 officers stationed outside Dad's ICU room to ensure nobody unauthorized could access him. I sat back down next to my father's bed and realized I was shaking uncontrollably. My father woke up around midnight, more alert than he'd been in days. The foampizole treatment was working, reducing the poison level in his blood and allowing his kidneys to begin recovering. He asked where Nathan was, and I said he'd gone home. He asked if Veronica was coming tomorrow, and I said I wasn't sure. Then he looked at me directly and asked what was really happening because he could tell something was wrong. I sat there, trying to figure out how to tell my 72-year-old father that his children had been slowly killing him for his money. I settled on saying the doctors had figured out why he'd been sick and were treating the cause, and that he should focus on resting and getting better. He wasn't satisfied with that answer, but he was too weak to push for more information. He fell back asleep, holding my hand. His grip so fragile, I was afraid he might not survive the night, despite the treatment. A nurse came in to check his vitals and said his kidney function was already showing slight improvement. She said if the antidote had been administered even a week later, the damage might have been irreversible. Detective Cross called me the next morning with an update. The search of Nathan's home had uncovered 2 more bottles of antifreeze in his garage, one opened and one sealed. They'd also found life insurance policies on my father that I hadn't known existed, 3 different policies, totaling $2 million with Nathan listed as beneficiary on all 3. The policies had been taken out within the past year, all requiring my father's signature. Detective Cross said they were investigating whether those signatures were forged or if Nathan had somehow convinced Dad to sign them without understanding what they were. The search of Veronica's apartment had found similar antifreeze bottles in her storage unit, along with internet search history showing repeated queries about untraceable poisons and symptoms of kidney failure. Both siblings were being held pending formal charges, and the district attorney was considering filing attempted murder charges against both of them. Nathan's attorney was already talking about plea deals, claiming Nathan had acted alone and Veronica had no knowledge of the poisoning. Veronica's attorney was saying the exact opposite. My father was moved out of intensive care after 3 days of treatment. His kidney function had improved significantly, and doctors were optimistic that he'd avoid permanent dialysis. The neurological symptoms were also resolving as the poison left his system. I stayed with him constantly, sleeping in a chair beside his hospital bed and helping him eat soft foods when he had appetite. He asked questions about Nathan and Veronica that I deflected, saying they were dealing with some personal issues and couldn't visit right now. He seemed to sense I was hiding something but didn't have the energy to interrogate me properly. Amanda drove down from Seattle on Thursday and brought me clean clothes and real food. She sat with me in Dad's hospital room and held my hand while I finally let myself fall apart. I'd been operating on pure adrenaline and shock for nearly a week, and the reality of what my siblings had done was starting to hit. Amanda listened while I cried and told her I couldn't understand how Nathan and Veronica had convinced themselves that slowly poisoning our father was acceptable. Dr. Reese came by on Friday to check on Dad's progress and to tell me the police wanted a formal statement about when I'd first suspected poisoning. He said Adult Protective Services was also investigating how Nathan had obtained power of attorney and whether Dad had been competent to make that legal decision in March. I asked if Dad would need long-term care after discharge, and Dr. Reese said probably not, that his prognosis was remarkably good, considering how close he'd come to dying. The human body was resilient when given proper treatment, and my father was responding well to dialysis and supportive care. He'd likely regain most of his previous function within a few months. The psychological recovery would take longer, Dr. Reese said carefully. Learning that your children tried to kill you for money wasn't something people got over quickly. I asked how I was supposed to tell him, and Dr. Reese said a hospital social worker could help facilitate that conversation when the time was right, but there was no rush. My father needed to focus on physical healing first. The district attorney filed attempted murder charges against both Nathan and Veronica on Monday afternoon. Detective Cross called to tell me and asked if I could come to the station to give a formal statement. I left Amanda with Dad and drove to the police station, where I spent 4 hours recounting every detail of the past week. The detective recorded everything and asked me to clarify timeline details and explain the family dynamics that might have motivated my siblings to commit such a crime. I told her Nathan had always been the golden child, the responsible one who stayed close and took care of family obligations while I pursued my career in Seattle. Veronica had struggled financially for years despite her design work, always complaining about money and expenses. But I'd never imagined either of them capable of murder. Detective Cross said financial desperation combined with perceived entitlement was a common motive in family poisoning cases. Nathan and Veronica had likely convinced themselves they deserved the inheritance more than I did because they'd been more present in Dad's life. The power of attorney gave Nathan control over Dad's finances and medical decisions, which meant he could have easily facilitated the poisoning without outside interference. Nathan's attorney reached out to my lawyer the following week with a proposed statement. Nathan was willing to plead guilty to attempted murder and testify against Veronica in exchange for a reduced sentence of 15 years with possibility of parole. The statement claimed Veronica had initiated the poisoning scheme in March after discovering Dad's estate was worth over $3 million. She'd researched antifreeze poisoning and convinced Nathan to help her by arguing that Dad was old and wouldn't have many good years left anyway. They'd agreed to split the inheritance between them and gradually cut me out by claiming I was too busy with work to care about family. Nathan's statement said he'd administered most of the poison because he had daily access through his caregiving visits, but Veronica had provided the antifreeze and kept detailed records of symptoms to ensure the dosing looked like natural decline. The notebook in Nathan's truck had been Veronica's idea, a way to track effectiveness and adjust amounts as needed. My lawyer said the prosecution found the statement credible because it matched evidence they'd gathered independently. Veronica's attorney countered with a different narrative. Veronica was willing to plead guilty to conspiracy and testify that Nathan had masterminded everything. According to her statement, Nathan had approached her in March with a plan already formed. He'd researched antifreeze poisoning and determined it would mimic natural kidney failure in an elderly patient. He'd convinced Veronica to help by promising they'd split the inheritance equally and I'd never know what really happened. Veronica claimed she'd only agreed because Nathan said Dad was suffering and would want to die with dignity rather than decline slowly over years. She'd purchased the antifreeze bottles and stored them in her apartment, but Nathan had administered all the doses during his daily visits. She'd been horrified when she learned how much poison Nathan was using and had tried to back out of the plan in July, but Nathan threatened to frame her as the sole perpetrator if she didn't continue helping. My lawyer said both statements were self-serving attempts to minimize culpability, and the prosecution would likely charge both siblings with equal responsibility regardless of who initiated the scheme. I had to tell my father the truth before the trial started, and media coverage made it impossible to protect him from the details. The hospital social worker sat with us in his room while I explained that Nathan and Veronica had been poisoning him for 6 months to inherit his estate early. My father listened without speaking, his face going gray as I walked through the evidence. The antifreeze bottles, the notebook documenting dosing schedules, the life insurance policies Nathan had taken out, the search history on Veronica's computer. When I finished, he closed his eyes and didn't open them for several minutes. The social worker asked if he needed anything, and he shook his head. Then he asked me if I was certain, if there was any possibility of a mistake or misunderstanding. I told him the evidence was overwhelming and both Nathan and Veronica had given statements admitting to the poisoning, though each blamed the other for initiating it. My father started crying silently, tears running down his face while he stared at the ceiling. He said he couldn't understand how his children could do this to him, that he'd given them everything and loved them unconditionally their entire lives. The preliminary hearing took place in October with both Nathan and Veronica present in court for the first time since their arrests. I sat in the gallery with Amanda while prosecutors presented evidence to establish probable cause for trial. Nathan and Veronica sat at separate defense tables with their attorneys, carefully avoiding looking at each other or at me. The judge reviewed the antifreeze bottles, the dosing notebook, the life insurance policies, the search histories, and the hospital records documenting ethylene glycol poisoning. The prosecutor called Dr. Reese to testify about the medical evidence and Detective Cross to explain the investigation timeline. Both siblings' attorneys tried to suppress various pieces of evidence, arguing improper search procedures or violation of rights, but the judge denied most of their motions. At the end of the hearing, the judge found sufficient probable cause to proceed to trial on attempted murder charges for both defendants. Trial was scheduled for January, 3 months away. My father was released from the hospital in November with a walker and strict instructions for continued kidney monitoring. Dad moved in with Amanda and me in Seattle because he couldn't face living in the house where Nathan and Veronica had poisoned him. We converted our guest room into a bedroom for him and set up regular dialysis appointments at a nearby medical center. He was physically recovering well, but emotionally devastated, barely speaking most days and refusing to discuss Nathan or Veronica at all. I hired a therapist who specialized in trauma from family violence to work with him twice weekly. The therapist told me privately that my father was experiencing a profound crisis of identity and trust. Everything he'd believed about his children and his family had been destroyed, and he was struggling to find meaning or purpose when the people he'd loved most had tried to kill him for money. The therapist said recovery would take years and might never be complete. Some wounds were too deep to fully heal. I watched my father shuffle around our house with his walker, looking lost and diminished, and felt rage at my siblings that consumed me whenever I let myself think about what they'd done. Nathan accepted a plea deal in December, 15 years in prison with possibility of parole after 10 years, in exchange for his testimony against Veronica at her trial. The plea agreement required him to give a detailed account of the poisoning scheme, including who initiated it, how they obtained and administered the poison, and what their ultimate goal was. His formal statement matched his earlier account, claiming Veronica had researched the poisoning method and convinced him to participate. The prosecutor used Nathan's testimony to build a stronger case against Veronica, who refused to take a plea deal and insisted on going to trial. Her attorney was arguing that Nathan had manipulated her into a minor supporting role in a scheme he'd masterminded, and that she deserved a lesser sentence than attempted murder carried. The trial started in January, with jury selection taking 3 days. I sat through every session with my father beside me, both of us watching Veronica perform innocence for the jury while evidence mounted against her. The prosecution presented the antifreeze bottles found in Veronica's storage unit, the search history on her computer showing queries about untraceable poisons dated to February, and bank records proving she'd purchased life insurance policy applications that Nathan later submitted with forged signatures. They called Nathan to testify, and he spent 2 days on the witness stand describing how Veronica had approached him with the poisoning plan. He said she'd been desperate for money after a series of failed design contracts and had become obsessed with the idea that Dad's estate was being wasted on an old man who'd already lived a full life. She'd convinced Nathan that they could split the inheritance, and I'd never suspect anything, because I was too focused on my career to pay attention to family. Nathan testified that he'd gone along with the plan because he was also facing financial problems after his contracting business had slowed down. They'd seen the poisoning as a victimless crime, since Dad was old anyway and would die eventually. They'd just been accelerating the inevitable while ensuring the money stayed in the family rather than being spent on medical care or donated to charity. Veronica's attorney tried to discredit Nathan during cross-examination, pointing out that he'd already been convicted of attempted murder and was testifying in hopes of getting parole consideration. Nathan admitted he had motivation to lie but insisted his testimony was truthful. The attorney presented evidence suggesting Nathan had taken out the life insurance policies without Veronica's knowledge and had kept the dosing notebook in his truck, not hers. The attorney argued that Nathan was a master manipulator who'd tricked Veronica into minor involvement and was now blaming her to reduce his own culpability. The jury looked confused by the competing narratives. I testified on day 6, explaining how I'd found the antifreeze bottle and the notebook, and describing my siblings' behavior in the days before their arrests. The prosecution asked me about family dynamics, and I told them Nathan and Veronica had always been close, often coordinating against me when we were children. The defense attorney asked if I stood to inherit the entire $3 million estate now that my siblings were facing prison, implying I had motivation to see them convicted regardless of actual guilt. My father testified on day 8 in a wheelchair because he was too weak to walk the distance from the courtroom entrance to the witness stand. The prosecutor asked him about his relationship with his children, and he described Nathan and Veronica as devoted caregivers who'd spent months helping him with daily activities while he slowly died from what he'd thought was kidney disease. His voice broke when he said he'd trusted them completely and never suspected they were the source of his suffering. The prosecutor asked if he'd signed the life insurance policy applications, and he said he had no memory of signing them, that his neurological symptoms had caused significant confusion and memory loss during the period when the policies were dated. He said Nathan could have put documents in front of him and told him to sign without him understanding what they were. The defense attorney declined to cross-examine my father, probably recognizing that attacking a poisoning victim wouldn't endear them to the jury. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Veronica showed no emotion when the verdict was read. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison without possibility of parole for the first 15 years. My father died quietly in his sleep 2 years after the trial ended. His kidneys had never fully recovered from the poisoning, and he'd been on dialysis twice weekly for the remainder of his life. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as complications from organ failure secondary to poisoning, which meant Nathan and Veronica could potentially face additional charges for his death. The district attorney decided not to pursue murder charges since both siblings were already serving lengthy sentences, and my father's death had occurred years after the poisoning stopped. I buried my father in the same cemetery where my mother was interred, having died from cancer when I was 25. The funeral was small, with only Amanda, a few of Dad's old friends, and Shelby's neighbor who'd visited him in the hospital. Nathan and Veronica both filed requests to attend the funeral under guard, but I opposed both requests, and the judge denied them. I stood at my father's grave and realized I was the last member of my immediate family who wasn't dead or in prison. The estate went through probate with Nathan and Veronica legally barred from inheriting due to their criminal convictions. I inherited everything as the sole surviving beneficiary. $3 million that felt like blood money I didn't want. I sold Dad's house and donated most of the estate to organizations fighting elder abuse and family violence. I kept enough to cover the medical bills and legal fees that had accumulated over 2 years of trials and treatment. I think about my father constantly and wonder if he ever forgave Nathan and Veronica before he died. I never asked him, and he never said. Some questions are better left unanswered. I still work as an architect in Seattle and try not to think about the siblings I grew up with, who decided our father's life was worth less than their inheritance. Sometimes late at night, I wonder if there were signs I missed over the years, warnings that Nathan and Veronica were capable of murder that I'd ignored because I wanted to believe my family was normal. I'll never know for certain, and I've learned to live with that uncertainty. Justice was served in the legal sense. Whether it brought any real peace is still an open question. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.